The morning I signed my marriage certificate, I made a decision my grandfather would have approved of, though he would have pretended not to care. He was the kind of man who believed the smartest choices were usually the quiet ones, the kind nobody applauded at the time because nobody knew they had been made. I did not tell my husband exactly what had been left to me when my mother died. He knew the broad version. He knew I came from a family that had done well. He knew my mother had owned commercial property in western Pennsylvania and had built a regional industrial cleaning company from almost nothing after my father left when I was 10. He knew she died 4 years before my wedding. He knew I had spent most of my 20s helping her expand the business, and then after she was gone, I'm stepping back from the day-to-day operations once I hired a management team I trusted. What he did not know was the actual shape of what she left behind. He did not know about the controlling interest in the company. He did not know about the warehouse properties in Erie and Youngstown. He did not know about the private investment account my mother's financial advisor had managed conservatively for years. And he definitely did not know about the house on Lake Chautauqua that my mother bought in cash in her 50s and kept entirely in her own name. Because, as she once told me while signing the papers, there should always be one place in a woman's life that no one can talk her out of. I need to be fair before I go further. I was not hiding those things from my husband because he had given me any reason not to trust him. At least, but not directly. I was hiding them because of something his mother said to me 33 days before our wedding. It happened at our engagement dinner in Charlotte. His parents hosted it at their country club, which was exactly the sort of place where the staff moved quietly and the floral arrangements looked expensive without ever seeming cheerful. The dinner itself was perfectly nice on the surface. Candlelight, toasts, too many beige dresses. His mother had selected the menu personally and mentioned that fact often enough that it felt less like hospitality and more like branding. Her name was Diane. Everything about her looked arranged. Her hair never moved. Her lipstick never faded. She had a calm, practiced way of speaking that made even rude questions sound like harmless observations. On that night, she waited until dessert had been served and people were distracted. Then she touched my elbow lightly and asked whether I would help her find the ladies' room, because she still got turned around in that building, which I later learned was absurd because she had chaired half the club's events committee for 12 years. I went with her anyway. Instead of turning left toward the hallway, she stopped near a quiet alcove beside the coat check and smiled at me like we were about to share something warm and private. "You know," she said, "I've always admired women who are prepared." I remember smiling back because I didn't know yet where this was going. She tilted her head a little. "Your mother was obviously very prepared." I said yes, she had been. Then Diane said, in the same gentle tone someone might use to ask where I bought my shoes, "I imagine she made sure you were taken care of quite well." There are moments when a sentence lands in your body before it lands in your mind. That was one of them. I asked what she meant. She gave a small shrug, elegant and false. "Only that women like your mother tend not to leave things disorganized. Businesses, property, assets. I was simply saying she seems to have been responsible." Assets. That was the word. Not memories, not family matters, not how difficult it must have been. Assets. I told her my mother had handled her affairs carefully and that everything had been settled properly. I kept my voice polite because I was raised by a woman who believed composure was a form of self-respect. But then I asked if she wanted to go back before her husband started another speech no one had requested. Diane smiled again, but there was something quick and sharp behind it, like she had tested a locked door and made note of the hinges. On the drive home, my fiancé asked if everything had gone well with his mother, and I said yes. That was not entirely true, but it also wasn't entirely false. The conversation had gone well in the sense that she had learned nothing. 3 days later, I was in Pittsburgh sitting across from my mother's estate attorney. His name was Walter Bear, and he had known my mother since before I was born. He wore suspenders, drank weak coffee, and had the steady demeanor of a man who had spent 40 years watching families become less honest whenever paperwork entered the room. I told him I was getting married in a month and that I wanted everything reviewed before the wedding. He did not ask why. That was one of the things I appreciated about him. He understood that if a woman had made an appointment like that 3 weeks before her wedding, there was already a reason. We spent almost 4 hours going over everything: the company shares, the properties, the accounts, the existing holding structure, the beneficiary designations, The old operating authority that still listed me personally on several documents because I had been too busy and too emotionally exhausted after my mother's death to restructure them properly. When we were finished, the plan was simple, not flashy, not aggressive, just clean. The ownership interest would be transferred into a trust held solely in my name with a professional fiduciary as co-trust administrator for any major asset sale. The lake house would remain separately titled under the trust. The investment account would be retitled. Every document that could blur the line between personal marital property and inherited separate property would be revised, clarified, and filed. Walter slid his reading glasses down his nose and looked at me over the top of them. "Do you want me to say it out loud?" he asked, "or do you already know why you're doing this?" I knew. Still, I said, "Say it out loud." He folded his hands. "Because marriage can be loving and still become legally complicated. Because families can be warm and still become entitled. And because inherited assets should be protected before anyone makes you feel selfish for wanting them protected." I nodded. He nodded back like that settled it. When I left his office that afternoon, everything my mother had built was in the process of being moved behind locked doors nobody would see unless I chose to open them. I did not tell my fiancé what I had done. I told myself I would explain after the wedding. I told myself there was no point introducing unnecessary tension right before we got married. I told myself it was not deceit, it was timing. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just a nicer word for caution. Our wedding was in late September in Asheville. Small by choice, though his mother referred to it several times as intimate, which was her preferred term for anything she had not been able to expand, redesign, or dominate. And we got married at an old stone inn outside the city with a mountain view and a lawn that smelled faintly like rain when the sun hit it. My side was small, a few relatives, two close friends. My college roommate, who cried harder than I did. His side was larger and louder, his mother in pale blue silk, his father, Martin, who had the quiet look of a man used to being interrupted by his own wife, his younger sister, Chloe, who was perfectly pleasant, but watched people the way some women browse furniture, as if assessing whether they would fit into the room she preferred. My husband looked relieved and happy and slightly stunned the entire day. His name is Grant. He was and is a good man. I need that understood clearly because some stories begin with a terrible husband and then proceed exactly where you expect. This is not that kind of story. Grant was not cruel. He was not greedy. He was not secretly conspiring with his family. He did not marry me for money. In fact, what I liked most about him when we met was how little he performed around success. He worked in commercial lending. He was smart, measured, kind, in a way that did not advertise itself. He listened fully when people spoke. He never treated waitstaff badly. He called when he said he would call. He apologized directly when he was wrong. He was also deeply loyal to his family. At the time, I thought that was a good thing. Maybe it was. Maybe loyalty is always good until it is tested by whether it belongs to the right person. The first month of marriage was ordinary in all the ways that make ordinary life feel like a reward. We moved into the house we had bought in Nashville 6 months before the wedding. We argued mildly about where mugs should go. We started taking walks after dinner because the neighborhood was quiet and because we liked the feeling of coming home at the same time. He left for work early. I worked mostly remote in an oversight role tied to the company's executive team and traveled back to Pennsylvania once or twice a month for board meetings and site visits. Tuesday became grocery night. Friday became takeout on the couch. Sunday mornings became coffee outside if the weather was decent. Those first weeks, if you had asked me whether I felt safe in my marriage, I would have said yes without hesitation. Then 6 weeks after the wedding, his mother came to my house with an attorney. It was a Wednesday, just after 1 in the afternoon. The Grant was in Atlanta for meetings and was not due back until late evening. I was home, still in workout clothes, reviewing some operating reports from one of our Ohio facilities and half listening to the dryer buzz in the laundry room. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was a package. Instead, I opened the door and found Diane standing on the porch in a cream jacket and narrow tan heels, one hand resting lightly on a leather handbag that probably cost more than my first car. Beside her stood a man I had never seen before. He was maybe 60, silver-haired, polite-looking, with the alert, unreadable expression of someone paid to sit near awkwardness without participating in it. Diane smiled as though we had planned lunch. "Charlotte was on our way back," she said. Nah, I thought I'd stop in for a little visit. Charlotte was not on the way back from anywhere to Nashville. But before I could answer, she turned slightly and gestured to the man beside her. This is Neil Foster. He handles some family legal matters for us. Neil nodded. Pleasure to meet you. I had enough time for one clear thought, and it was this. No good conversation begins with the phrase family legal matters on your front porch. But politeness is muscle memory, and mine was strong, so I stepped aside and let them in. Diane walked through my foyer with the ease of a woman who regarded other people's homes as temporary extensions of her own influence. Neil followed, carrying a slim, dark portfolio. I led them to the kitchen because there was nowhere else to put that kind of conversation without pretending it was social. I offered coffee, or as water, tea. Diane said no to all of it. Neil set the portfolio on my kitchen table and waited. I sat across from them, and for a brief second, the whole thing had such a bizarre stillness to it that I almost convinced myself I was overreacting. Then Diane folded her hands and said, I wanted to discuss something sensitive before it became stressful for everyone. I said nothing. She continued in the tone people use when they have already decided what should happen and are only performing the courtesy of explanation. There have been some temporary financial strains related to a family business matter. Nothing catastrophic, she added quickly, but enough that we're reviewing options. I remember the exact way the refrigerator hummed behind me. Grant had mentioned market pressure before, delayed deals, a tighter lending environment, and clients being cautious. But he had not said anything that suggested family crisis, and the phrase family business matter was slippery enough that it could mean almost anything. I asked, what does that have to do with me? Diane's expression did not change. Quite a lot, potentially. You're part of this family now. Neil opened the portfolio and removed a neat stack of documents. There is something very specific about the sound of legal paper being placed on a table. It doesn't thud. It settles. Flat. Deliberate. Impossible to mistake for anything casual. Neil slid the top document toward me. This is simply a proposed authorization, he said, for a voluntary capital contribution into a holding entity that would be used to stabilize several obligations and prevent unnecessary exposure. I looked at the paper, then at him. Then back at Diane, I said, I'm sorry, what is this? Diane gave a small, patient smile, the kind women like her reserve for people they assume are behind the conversation by at least 2 steps. We thought, she said, that given the resources your mother left you, and given that marriage means building together, this might be an appropriate moment for generosity. There are times when your body becomes very calm, because anger has arrived so cleanly it no longer needs noise. That was how I felt. I picked up the first page and scanned it. It was dressed up as a voluntary transfer, but that was all it was. A request, masked with legal language, for me to move a substantial sum tied to inherited assets into an LLC controlled by Diane. Not Grant, Diane. I put the page down carefully. I think you should explain, I said. But why you are sitting in my kitchen asking me to transfer inherited assets into an entity managed by my mother-in-law. Neil inhaled slightly, as if he preferred not to be the one holding the answer. Diane, however, looked almost relieved that the conversation had finally become plain. No one is asking you to do anything improper, she said. This would simply be a family contribution, temporary support. It keeps things cleaner than loans and less embarrassing than outside intervention. I asked, how do you know what my mother left me? That was the first question that visibly bothered her, only slightly, a pause, a flicker. Then she said, one does try to understand the overall landscape when a son gets married. I stared at her. She added, I'm his mother. Due diligence is not a crime. No, I thought, but it can be a warning. This I looked down again at the papers and saw enough to understand their assumption. They had built these documents around public estate references and old ownership structures. They thought the money and control still sat where it had sat before Walter and I changed everything, which meant 2 things at once. First, Diane had absolutely done some version of research into my mother's estate after our engagement. And second, she was working from information that was already outdated. I cannot fully explain the kind of steadiness that gives a woman. Not joy, not triumph, just footing. I placed the papers back on the table. Then I said very evenly, I'm not signing anything. Diane's smile dimmed, but did not disappear. I don't think you should answer so quickly. I answered exactly as quickly as this deserves. Neil spoke for the first time in almost a minute. To be clear, this is a request, not a demand. I turned to him. To be clear, bringing legal paperwork to my home without notice while my husband is out of town is coercive theater, and I'm not interested in participating. That landed harder than I expected. Even Diane blinked. Then she leaned back slightly and crossed one leg over the other. You may be misunderstanding the spirit of this. No, I said, I understand it perfectly. Her voice cooled by a degree. Marriage requires flexibility. So does integrity. For the first time since she arrived, the air in the room changed completely. She stopped pretending this was warm. I stopped pretending it was merely awkward. Diane looked at me the way certain women do when they realize charm is not going to get them what they want and are deciding whether contempt might work better. You are being surprisingly territorial, she said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so shameless. About my late mother's estate? I asked. Yes, I am. She pressed her lips together. Then she said quietly, I hope for Grant's sake you're not one of those women who confuses marriage with possession. That line was meant to shame me, to pull me back toward politeness, toward appearing generous, toward proving I was not difficult, not cold, not selfish. It might have worked if I had not sat in Walter's office a month before my wedding and made every important decision before anyone was there to watch me make it. Instead, I stood up. I said, This conversation is over. You both need to leave. Neil immediately began gathering the papers. He did it with the efficient expression of a man who had likely watched negotiations collapse before and preferred not to be present for whatever came next. Diane stayed seated for 3 more seconds, just long enough to make disobedience part of the scene. Then she rose, lifted her handbag, and gave me a look I would later come to recognize as a real face. Not dramatic, not furious, worse, offended. As if I had failed some private audition, she had been running without my permission. At the doorway, she paused. I do hope, she said, that you'll think carefully before creating division in your first year of marriage. I opened the front door and held it there. I hope you'll think carefully before showing up at my house again with paperwork. She walked out without another word. Neil gave me a brief nod that was almost apologetic and followed her to the car. I closed the door, then I locked it. Then I stood in my own foyer with one hand still on the deadbolt and let the silence settle around me. There's a moment after something like that happens when your body asks your mind to confirm whether it was real, whether a woman you are supposed to call family actually came into your home and tried to extract money from you using marriage as leverage. I walked back to the kitchen and sat down very slowly. Neil had taken most of the documents, but one summary sheet remained on the table, probably left behind in haste. I read it once. That was enough. The numbers were ugly. The structure was uglier. Not and unless I was reading it wrong. Whatever Diane was trying to stabilize was larger and messier than a short-term cash problem. I reached for my phone and called Walter. He answered on the third ring. I told him everything from the moment the doorbell rang. He did not interrupt. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. And then he said, in the driest tone imaginable, Well, that was ambitious of her. Somehow that nearly made me laugh. I asked him whether there was any risk in what she had brought. No, he said, not if you don't sign things you haven't requested from your own counsel, which I trust you are not about to start doing out of boredom. I'm serious. So am I. What they presented appears to rely on an ownership picture that no longer exists. That was the entire point of the restructuring. They can ask. They can imply, they can attempt to pressure, but they cannot reach through a trust and take what is not theirs because a mother-in-law has decided family means access. I closed my eyes for a second. The steadiness in his voice settled something in me. What should I do now? I asked. Email me a summary while it's fresh. Photograph anything they left behind. Do not have another conversation with her about this directly today and tell your husband exactly what happened in that order. I said, okay. Then I hung up and sat there for another full minute before calling Grant. He answered almost immediately, cheerful at first, the way people do when they assume the call is ordinary. Hey, he said, everything okay? I looked at the paper still sitting on my kitchen table. Then I said, But your mother came to the house with an attorney and tried to get me to sign documents transferring inherited assets into an entity she controls. Silence. Not disbelief exactly. More like impact. I waited. Finally, he said, "She did what?" I repeated it slower this time. I told him about Diane standing on the porch, about Neil Foster, about the documents, about the phrase family contribution, about her asking me what kind of division I wanted to create in my first year of marriage. When I finished, there was another silence on the line, shorter this time, but heavier. Then Grant said very carefully, "I'm coming home." She said there were financial strains. I don't know what she's talking about. She seemed to think I was supposed to fix them. Another pause. Then, in a voice I had never heard from him before, and flat and controlled and furious underneath, he said, "Do not answer if she calls you again. Don't respond to anything. I'll handle this." I believed him. That may sound simple, but it mattered. I believed the shock in his voice. I believed the anger. I believed he had not known she would do this. Still, belief does not erase what has already happened. After I got off the phone, I photographed the paper Neil left behind and sent everything to Walter with a written summary. Then I locked the back door too, even though I already knew Diane was not coming back that afternoon. By 4 o'clock, I had done no real work. I had stared at the same spreadsheet for almost an hour without absorbing a single number. At 5:30, I changed clothes. This then changed them again because both options made me feel as though I were dressing for the wrong kind of night. At 7:12, Grant walked through the front door. He looked like a man who had driven too fast for too long while trying to stay reasonable. His tie was gone, his sleeves were rolled up. His face was pale in a way that made him look suddenly younger and much more like his father. He came into the kitchen, saw the paper still on the table, and stopped. "Is that it?" he asked. I nodded. He picked it up and read it standing there. I watched his eyes move across the page once, then again more slowly. Then he put it down and looked at me. "I swear to you," he said, "I had no idea. I know there are people who would hear that and think I was naive for believing him. Maybe sometimes I am. But not that day." I said, "Am I? I know." He let out a breath that sounded almost like pain. Then he sat down in the exact chair his mother had used and put both hands over his mouth for a second, just pressing there as if trying to hold back whatever reaction wanted out first. When he finally looked up, he said, "Tell me everything again from the beginning." So I did, and this time, with him sitting there across from me, while the evening darkened outside the windows and the dryer had long since gone cold, in the laundry room and dinner had ceased to matter, I told him every single detail. I told him about the engagement dinner question in Charlotte, the word assets, the office visit with Walter, the restructuring before the wedding, and the reason I had done it. I expected hurt, or at least surprise. What I saw instead was something quieter and more devastating, an understanding, not just of what his mother had done that afternoon, but of why I had felt the need to protect myself before I even married him. And that more than the papers on the table was what changed the room. Grant did not interrupt me once. That was one of the things I noticed most in the months after everything happened. He never tried to soften what his mother had done by inserting explanations too early. He did not rush to say she meant well. He did not ask whether I might have misunderstood the tone. He did not reach for those familiar little phrases people use when they want to make an ugly thing easier to hold. He just listened. I told him about the engagement dinner in Charlotte, the coat check alcove, the way Diane had said the word assets like she was asking about weather. I told him about driving to Pittsburgh 3 days later and spending almost 4 hours with Walter restructuring everything before the wedding. I told him I had planned to explain it after we got married, and then each week that passed without a problem made it feel harder and stranger to bring up. When I finished, Grant looked down at the paper again. Then he said, "I'm not upset you protected your inheritance." I hadn't realized until that second that some small guarded part of me had still been braced for that possibility. He rubbed one hand over his jaw and leaned back in the chair. "I'm upset," he said, "that you had a reason to think you needed to." That landed deeper than anything else had. I sat across from him at our kitchen table, in the same kitchen where less than 6 hours earlier his mother had sat like an auditor arriving to collect on a debt I never owed. And for the first time that day, I felt something inside me loosen. Not all the way, not enough to call it relief, but enough that I could breathe differently. Grant asked if my attorney had said there was any actual risk. I told him no. I explained the trust structure, the retitling, the fact that what Diane had brought was based on an outdated understanding of how my mother's assets were held. I explained that the request was legally meaningless unless I voluntarily signed something, and that I had no intention of doing that. He nodded slowly. Then he asked, how much did she think she was getting? I told him what was on the summary sheet Neil had left behind. Grant stared at me, and then he said a number under his breath that I won't repeat because he almost never swore. And when he did, it felt more forceful than when most people shouted. She wanted that from you, he asked. Yes. He looked sick. Not angry anymore, not exactly. Angry was part of it, but beneath that was something more destabilizing. The kind of disillusionment that takes a while to fully arrive because the mind keeps trying to put a familiar face back on a stranger. He stood up abruptly and walked to the sink, then back again, then stopped at the edge of the kitchen island with both hands braced against the counter. I need to call my father, he said. I asked if he wanted me to leave the room. He shook his head. No, stay. He called Martin first. Grant's father answered on speaker, though neither of us had intended that. The call connected with the background noise of a television somewhere and Martin's voice, calm and unsuspecting. Hey, son. Grant didn't ease into it. Did you know Mom went to our house today with a lawyer and tried to get Nora to sign over money? There was a pause so immediate and blank that I knew the answer before Martin gave it. What? Grant repeated himself. Another silence. Then Martin said slowly, no, I absolutely did not know that. The tone in his voice changed on the word absolutely. It sharpened without getting louder. I had spent enough time around families by then to recognize what it meant when the quieter parent finally understood the scale of something the louder parent had been hiding. Grant asked him whether there was some kind of business problem no one had told him about. Martin did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, he sounded older than he had at the rehearsal dinner, older than he had at Christmas, older than any man wants to sound when his son asks whether the family he built is what he thought it was. There are some issues, he said. I knew cash flow had tightened. I did not know your mother was improvising. Improvising. It was such a controlled word for what she had done that it almost made me laugh, except nothing about that evening was funny anymore. Grant asked him very directly whether Diane had authority over a holding entity that was carrying family debt. Martin admitted that she had been managing several property-related decisions for years, especially in connection with a property management business the family owned in parts and constantly referred to as if it were larger and healthier than it really was. And he said he had trusted her to oversee details because that had become their division of labor over time. He worked relationships and operations. She handled reporting, internal books, refinancing discussions, vendor negotiations, and what he kept calling the strategic side. The strategic side, as it turned out, had not been particularly honest. Martin said he would call us back after he had seen the paperwork himself. Grant ended the call and stood still for a moment, with the phone in his hand. Then he looked at me and said she didn't tell him either. That mattered more than I think either of us understood at the time. If Martin had been in on it, then this would have become a much larger marriage problem much faster. It would have meant the entire family system was aligned against me. Instead, and what sat in front of us was narrower, but in some ways sadder. Diane had operated alone, or close to it, long enough to start believing she could rearrange reality without permission and call it management. Grant asked if I had eaten. I hadn't, neither had he. We ordered Thai food and left it untouched on the counter for almost half an hour because neither of us had the appetite to pretend we were having an ordinary dinner. Eventually, he opened the containers, put a rice on 2 plates, and we ate at the kitchen island in small distracted bites while going over everything again. That was the rhythm of that first night. Facts, poses, fragments of food, more facts. At some point, he asked me why I never told him about the lake house. I said, because once I didn't tell you before the wedding, it became harder to know when to say it without making it feel like I had deliberately withheld it. He nodded like that made sense. Then he surprised me. He said, you know what's strange? I think if you'd told my mother even one specific detail, she would have built a whole story around it. Not because it was true, just because she would have had more material. That was exactly right. Diane did not need information to understand a person. She only needed information to arrange them. The call from Martin came a little after 9. This time he was not in front of the television. The sound around him was dead quiet, and I could picture him having stepped into his study and closed the door. He asked if I was comfortable being on the call, and when I said yes, he spoke with a level of directness I had never heard from him before. Because he had confronted Diane. She had admitted there were liabilities tied to several underperforming properties, plus a refinancing problem, plus vendor obligations she had been rolling forward for months in the hope that one pending sale would solve everything. The pending sale had fallen through. She had not told him the full extent because, in her words, she had been trying to manage it before it became dramatic. Martin repeated that phrase with obvious disgust. Manage it before it became dramatic. As if showing up uninvited at your daughter-in-law's house with legal paperwork was the non-dramatic option. He said Diane also admitted that after our engagement, she had paid an investigator. I'm not some shady criminal investigator, but one of those discreet background research firms wealthy people hire when they want private answers while still calling themselves respectable. The firm had found public probate and estate references tied to my mother's holdings. They had given Diane just enough information to convince her she understood the landscape and just enough confidence to become dangerous. When Martin said that, Grant closed his eyes. I watched him go very still. Martin went on. He said Diane believed that because the money was inherited and because I was new to the family, I would be easier to pressure now than later. She thought a request framed as helping family would put me in a position where refusal would feel selfish. She thought making the ask quietly, woman to woman, before involving the men, that's as she apparently put it, would keep everyone from overreacting. That was when Grant finally spoke. He said, "The men?" Martin was silent for a second. Then he said, "Yes." That was the phrase she used. Grant laughed once, but there was no humor in it. My own reaction was harder to name. Anger, certainly, but underneath it, something colder, something almost clinical. Because once Martin said that, the whole thing revealed itself with unbearable clarity. Diane had not come to my house because she respected me enough to make a private appeal. She had come because she thought I was the softer target, a new wife, newly folded into their family, socialized to keep the peace, reluctant to embarrass anyone, eager not to look hard or suspicious or difficult, easier to shame than to persuade, and easier to isolate than to confront in front of witnesses. And she had chosen a weekday afternoon while her son was out of town because she knew exactly what she was doing. Martin apologized to me then, not in the vague, inherited way people apologize for another person's behavior. He apologized specifically for what had happened, for not knowing more, for assuming his wife had been handling ordinary financial strain rather than quietly detonating trust. He said no one would contact me again about money and that he would make sure of it. I thanked him. When the call ended, the house felt different, not calmer, just clearer. I think that is one of the worst parts of betrayal in family systems. Once the truth comes into focus, you begin seeing earlier moments differently. Small comments, strange tones, like questions that felt rude but not important enough to challenge at the time. The mind starts reorganizing the past without your permission. I went upstairs that night and stood in our bathroom brushing my teeth, while Grant sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I asked him what he was thinking. He said, "I'm trying to figure out how many things I missed because I didn't want to think badly of her." That was honest enough that I stopped brushing and looked at him in the mirror. He met my eyes. Then he said, "And I'm wondering whether she picked you because she assumed you'd want to be liked more than you'd want to be safe." I rinsed my toothbrush and set it down. "She probably assumed that because it works on a lot of women," I said. He nodded once. Then he said quietly, "Anal, I'm sorry." Not the rushed kind of sorry people offer when they want to end discomfort. A full one, a painful one. The kind that admits the apology cannot fix the thing, but should still be said, because truth matters even when it's late. I went over to him and stood between his knees, and he wrapped his arms around me and pressed his forehead against my stomach, like he was tired all the way through. We went to bed that night without turning on the television, without reading, without pretending sleep would come easily. Sometime after midnight, I woke up and realized Grant was not beside me. I found him downstairs in the dark kitchen, sitting where his mother had sat earlier that day. There was no dramatic scene, no smashed glass, no raised voice. He was just sitting there in the dark with both hands around a mug of water he hadn't drunk. I asked if he was okay. He looked up at me and said, "No, but I will be." Then he added, "I keep thinking about her choosing the hour, making sure I wasn't here." I sat down across from him. After a long silence, he said, "That's the part I can't get past. Not even the money, the setup." Yes, I thought, exactly. Because the money was ugly. The entitlement was uglier, but the choreography of it told the truest story. Diane had not simply panicked and asked for help badly, she had planned a controlled extraction and arrived dressed for respectability. The next morning, Walter called me before 9. He had reviewed the photographs and summary materials and, in his careful, understated way, confirmed what we already suspected. Diane's request had no legal power. More importantly, the structure she believed existed no longer did. There were still a few housekeeping steps he wanted to tighten, mostly access and notification procedures, but the core protections were solid. Then he asked whether any of my home address information or personal signatures were still tied to old operating documents in ways that might invite harassment or confusion. That question sent me down an administrative tunnel I had been meaning to deal with for over a year. By noon, I had a list: corporate filings, managerial authorizations, emergency contacts, secondary mailing instructions, signature specimens at 2 institutions, an old advisory permission for 1 investment account. Nothing disastrous, but enough loose threads to bother me now that I had seen how willing Diane was to pull on anything she thought might move. I spent the day locking everything down. There is a very unromantic side to protecting yourself that people rarely talk about. It is not all dramatic courtroom strategy and last-minute legal brilliance. Much of it is document review. It is emails with subject lines like "updated authorization request." It is scanning forms and confirming addresses and asking whether a previous administrator still has view-only access. It is sitting at your desk in leggings and a sweatshirt, while a cup of coffee goes cold beside you, and realizing that personal safety, at least in financial matters, often looks boring from the outside. Grant came home early again that day. He found me at the dining table with my laptop, 3 folders, and Walter on speakerphone walking me through a revised set of document instructions. Grant did not ask whether I was overreacting. He did not say maybe we should wait until things settled. He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. At one point, Walter said, "I'm sorry to turn your 2nd month of marriage into an estate planning seminar." Grant said without hesitation, "I'd rather sit through 10 seminars than another surprise visit from my mother." Walter went quiet for half a second, then said, "Well, that is an excellent prioritization." After the call, Grant asked me to explain the structure from the beginning so he would understand it fully, not because he expected access, because he wanted clarity. He wanted to know what existed, where it sat, what the legal lines were, and how he could help protect those lines rather than accidentally blur them. So I told him, not every dollar, not because I was still hiding, but because the point was not inventory. The point was architecture. I explained the trust, the professional co-administrator, the distinction between inherited separate property and marital assets, the reason my mother had never mixed personal sentiment with business control, the lake house and why it mattered, the company and why I still felt responsible for the people who worked there, even though I had stepped back from daily management. He listened the way he always listened when something mattered. Then he asked, "Do you want me to sign something?" I blinked. "What?" He shrugged, almost awkwardly. "I don't know, a post-nuptial agreement, a waiver, something that makes it plain I have no claim and never intend to." That was the first moment since Diane showed up that I almost cried. Not because I doubted him before, or because I did not realize how much I needed to hear him move toward protection instead of away from it. I told him we didn't need to decide at that minute. Walter might recommend some version of it later, and if he did, we could discuss it. But hearing Grant offer without ego, without injury, without turning it into a referendum on trust, mattered more than I could explain. He nodded. Then he said, "I love you. I'm not marrying your mother's work. I married you." That sentence sat with me for a long time. Not because it was polished. It wasn't. It sounded like something he had arrived at only after wrestling through his own bruised feelings about secrecy, family loyalty, and the humiliation of discovering his mother had treated his marriage like a resource acquisition. But it was real, and real mattered more than smooth. The rest of that week unfolded in layers. Martin sent Grant partial financial records he had forced Diane to hand over. Grant reviewed them at night with the stunned concentration of someone discovering he had lived inside a family story, with several chapters missing. The property management business was not collapsing exactly, but it had been badly mismanaged. Diane had over-leveraged 2 acquisitions, delayed payments to vendors, buried shortfalls under optimistic assumptions, and kept telling herself the next deal would solve the last problem. It never does. People who operate that way are not always stupid. Often they are worse than stupid. They are plausible. They know enough to keep the machine moving and enough to make themselves sound competent while it does. They live on deferral, on tomorrow, on almost. On this will look better after the quarter closes, on once this asset sells, on when the market loosens, and when those stories stop working, they go shopping for rescue. In Diane's case, the rescue had apparently been me. By Friday evening, Grant had spoken to her twice more. Both calls ended badly. He did not tell me every word, and I didn't ask, but I gathered enough. At first, she defended herself. She said she had been trying to protect the family from embarrassment. She said I was making everything harsher than it needed to be. She said if I had simply considered the request privately, none of this would have spiraled. She said she had no intention of taking anything permanently. She said it was effectively a bridge. She said everyone was being too sensitive. Then, when those arguments failed, she shifted tactics. She cried. And not the kind of crying that comes from clear remorse. The kind that arrives when control is slipping and tears are the oldest tool left in the drawer. Grant did not soften. Later that night, he told me, I think this is the first time in my life she's realizing that being upset won't automatically make her right. I asked whether he felt cruel. He thought for a moment before answering. No, he said, I feel late. That sentence stayed with me too, because late was exactly what family reckonings often are. Rarely clean, rarely sudden, usually just a long backlog of moments you didn't challenge because the cost of challenging them seemed higher than the cost of carrying them. Until one day, the bill arrives anyway. That Sunday, Diane texted me for the first time since the visit. The message was only 2 lines. I never intended to make you uncomfortable. I hope at some point we can speak woman to woman without all this interference. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds. Then I handed my phone to Grant. He read it and laughed once, incredulous. Interference, he said. Apparently I'm interference in my own marriage. I didn't answer her. Walter had advised no direct conversation, and beyond that I had no interest in participating in Diane's preferred framing. Woman to woman was just another way of saying quietly enough that no one can hold me fully accountable later. That night, lying in bed beside Grant while rain moved softly against the windows, I thought about my mother. She would not have liked Diane, not because Diane was polished or socially strategic or controlling. Like my mother had known women like that her entire life, and often got along with them perfectly well at charity lunches and board dinners. No, what she would have disliked was the assumption underneath Diane's behavior. The assumption that a daughter's inheritance is softer than a son's authority, that a widow's legacy is somehow more negotiable, that what a woman builds can be redirected through guilt if you catch the next woman at the right emotional angle. My mother hated that instinct in people. She used to say that some families hear the word marriage and think merger. And lying there in the dark, I realized that was exactly what Diane had heard. Not marriage, access. The following Monday, Walter recommended something specific, a formal post-nuptial acknowledgement, not because Grant had done anything wrong, and not because our marriage was in danger, but because clarity, once threatened, should be restored in writing. He said couples in healthy marriages sometimes did this precisely because they did not want future confusion, outside pressure, or later legal mess created by assumptions no one had bothered to correct on paper. When I told Grant what Walter suggested, he said yes before I finished the sentence. No wounded pride, no speeches, just yes. That more than any apology told me who I had married. But signing it would mean sitting in a lawyer's office together and putting all of it into language no one could later pretend to misunderstand. And as reasonable as that was, it also meant the next step could not stay administrative forever. Because Diane, for all her polished confidence, and still did not yet understand the one part of this situation she had gotten most wrong. She thought she had almost reached something she could have had. What she did not know was that even before my wedding, I had moved every important piece of my life somewhere she could never touch. And the first time she heard the full extent of that, she did not take it well. We signed the post-nuptial acknowledgement the following Thursday. Walter had arranged for a Nashville attorney he trusted to handle the local execution, so we would not have to fly to Pittsburgh for what was, in essence, a formal statement of facts. Grant and I drove there together in near silence, not because anything was wrong between us, but because we both understood the odd weight of what we were doing. It is a strange thing to sit beside the person you love and head toward an office where the law will write down, in precise, unemotional language, the lines your life now has to carry because someone else tried to cross them. The attorney's office was on the 12th floor of a glass building downtown. The lobby smelled faintly like lemon polish and coffee. Everything about it was neutral in the expensive way that tries to reassure clients they are in competent hands. The attorney was a woman named Melissa Caro, mid-40s, navy suit, efficient without being cold. She had already reviewed Walter's materials and only asked a few direct questions to confirm that neither of us was under pressure from the other. Then she walked us through the document page by page. Inherited assets held before the marriage would remain separate. So any appreciation tied to those premarital holdings would remain separate unless intentionally commingled. The trust structure would be acknowledged. The company interests, the investment accounts, the out-of-state real property, all of it would be recognized as non-marital property absent explicit written amendment. Grant initialed each page without hesitation. At one point, Melissa looked at him over the folder and said, "You understand that this waives any future claim to these assets except by whatever your wife may voluntarily choose through estate planning." Grant said, "Yes." No pause, no visible sting. Just yes. Then he signed. I signed after him. When we were done, Melissa gathered the originals, gave each of us a copy, and said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "The healthiest couples I see in these offices are usually the least romantic looking on paper. They are the ones willing to be plain before life forces them to be." On the drive home, Grant kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting near the gear shift. About halfway back, he said, "I don't feel insulted by any of this." I turned toward him. He kept his eyes on the road and continued, "I feel embarrassed that someone in my family created a situation where this became necessary, but I don't feel insulted." I asked if he was sure. He nodded. "Honestly, it makes me trust you more. You protected what mattered before anyone pressured you, and then when it mattered, you told me the truth." I sat quietly for a moment, then I said, "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," he said. And it was such a simple, honest answer that I almost smiled. Then he glanced at me and added, "But I also understand why you didn't." That was how we were during those weeks. Not pretending either of us had handled every part perfectly. Not making saints of ourselves because we were on the same side now. Just telling the truth as cleanly as we could and moving from there. For about 8 days after that, things were almost calm, not normal. We were still too aware of everything under the surface for normal, but functional, steady. Grant went to work. I flew to Pennsylvania for a board meeting and spent 2 days reviewing operating numbers, vendor issues, and a possible equipment expansion at one of the facilities outside Erie. Nobody there knew anything about what had happened with Diane, and I was grateful for that. But there is something profoundly soothing about walking into a conference room where the only urgent problems involve labor ratios and maintenance schedules instead of family manipulation wrapped in legal paper. When I came home, Grant made pasta badly and proudly. We sat on the back porch after dinner and talked about unremarkable things on purpose. The weather, a colleague of his who was leaving for a competitor, a supplier dispute at one of our sites, whether we wanted to host Thanksgiving ourselves or travel. It was the first evening since Diane's visit that felt remotely like the life we thought we were building. Then Martin called. It was a Sunday afternoon. Grant was mowing the lawn, and I was inside folding laundry when my phone rang. Martin almost never called me directly, so I knew immediately it wasn't social. I answered. Then after the briefest greeting, he asked, "Are you alone?" I said yes. He let out a breath. Then he said, "Diane found out about the post-nuptial acknowledgement." I stopped folding the towel in my hands. "How?" "She opened mail that wasn't hers. That unfortunately tracked." He explained that a copy of one related notice had been mailed to the Charlotte office address tied to one of Grant's older financial records, not because anyone had sent Diane the document itself, but because a linked administrative update triggered routine correspondence. Martin had seen the envelope on the entry table. Diane had opened it before he got home. He sounded deeply tired. "I thought you should know," he said. "She is not reacting well." Those last four words were almost understated enough to be funny. I asked what not reacting well meant. That Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She believes the two of you have humiliated her. She says you intentionally structured things to exclude the family and that the postnuptial agreement was a hostile gesture." I sat down slowly in one of the dining chairs. It is amazing how people like Diane can break into your house metaphorically and still experience your locks as aggression. I asked whether she had said anything specific. Martin hesitated. Then he said, "She believes Grant was influenced into distrusting his own family. She believes you have made her look predatory." I looked toward the window where I could see Grant crossing the yard behind the mower. "Did you tell her she did that herself?" I asked. A dry sound came through the phone. Not quite laughter. "Yes," Martin said. It did not improve the discussion. He told me Diane had spent the better part of 2 days swinging between indignation and self-pity. At first, she insisted the postnuptial acknowledgement was insulting because it implied there had been a legitimate threat. Then, when Martin pointed out that she had literally brought a lawyer to my house to ask for money, she shifted to a different argument. She said that if I had intended to build a real relationship with them, I would have disclosed my financial position earlier, openly, as a gesture of trust. She said secrecy breeds defensiveness. She said perhaps if she had known the full picture from the start, none of this would have unfolded so badly. That was the version she needed, the one where my discretion caused her entitlement. Martin said, "I don't want you blindsided if she reaches out." I thanked him and hung up. For a few minutes, I just sat there with the half-folded towel in my lap, listening to the muffled sound of the mower outside and thinking about how quickly certain people turn boundaries into evidence of betrayal. When Grant came in, flushed and grass-streaked and carrying the smell of cut lawn with him, I told him about the call. He did not react right away. He walked to the sink, washed his hands, dried them carefully, and then leaned back against the counter with that same hard stillness I had seen in him more than once since all this started. "She opened mail that wasn't hers," he repeated. "Yes." He nodded once, almost to himself. Then he said, "I'm done handling this privately." That sentence changed the temperature of the room. Until then, Grant had been trying to contain the damage inside direct calls and immediate family conversations. He had not been minimizing what Diane did, but he had still been working from the assumption that if the right truth was said calmly enough, the situation could be corrected without larger fallout. That afternoon, for the first time, I saw that assumption leave him. I asked what he meant. He said his parents were supposed to come to Nashville the following weekend for a dinner that had already been on the calendar for over a month. His aunt and uncle from Knoxville were also driving in. So was Chloe with her fiancé. It was meant to be the first larger family gathering since our wedding. Casual, warm, symbolic. Grant said, "I'm not doing fake normal over dinner, while she tells herself we're the ones who escalated." I understood immediately. Not because I wanted a scene, I didn't. I am not built for scenes. But because I knew what Diane was counting on. Time, softness, social pressure, the way family events encourage everyone to step around the live wire in the room and compliment the salad instead. Grant said he was going to make something plain before that dinner happened. In front of the people Diane would most want to keep comfortable. Not to shame her theatrically, to end the fog. I asked if he was sure. He looked at me and said she came to our house when I wasn't here because she assumed privacy would help her. Privacy is over. That week crawled. Diane did not contact me directly. Not by text, not by email, not by call. But the silence itself felt active, not peaceful. Like weather gathering somewhere you couldn't see. Grant spoke to Martin twice. That both conversations were brief. Martin sounded resigned in a way that told me he had been fighting some version of Diane's self-justifying revisionism all week and was tired of losing the same argument against a woman who treated accountability like a personal attack. By Friday night, I almost suggested canceling the dinner. Not because I was afraid of Diane exactly, more because I could feel everyone walking toward a collision and knew there would be no elegant way through it. But Grant didn't want to cancel, and deep down I knew he was right not to. Cancellation would have become another useful story for Diane. She would have told herself, and eventually others, that I was uncomfortable, because I knew I had overreacted, that I preferred distance because I was the one creating it, that our absence proved immaturity rather than self-protection. No. If there was going to be a line, it needed to be drawn where she could not blur it afterward. The dinner was at our house on Saturday. I spent the morning cooking far more than I needed to because chopping vegetables is useful when your mind has nowhere good to rest. Grant vacuumed, set the table, and rearranged the chairs twice, even though the first arrangement had been perfectly fine. Around noon, he came into the kitchen while I was slicing fennel and said, "If at any point you want me to shut it down, I will." I set the knife down. "Are you asking me if I want to avoid it?" "I'm asking whether you want control over how much of this happens in your home." That mattered, the question itself. I thought about it honestly. Then I said, "No, I want it over." He nodded. And by 6:30, the house smelled like roasted chicken, garlic, wine, and tension. Martin and Diane arrived first. Martin looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier. Not dramatically, just worn around the eyes. Diane, by contrast, looked immaculate. Cream blouse, gold earrings, soft neutral makeup, expression composed to the point of artistry. If you had passed her in the hallway of a hotel, you would have thought she was on her way to host a tasteful charity luncheon. She kissed Grant on the cheek. She kissed the air near mine. Then she complimented the flowers on the table as if the last 2 weeks had consisted of mild scheduling confusion and not an attempted financial ambush, followed by a post-nuptial acknowledgement she now considered a betrayal. Grant was polite but cool. I matched him. Chloe and her fiancé arrived 10 minutes later. They're followed by Grant's Aunt Elise and Uncle Robert. They knew there had been some tension involving Diane and Martin's business concerns because families always know something before they know anything. But their manner suggested they did not know details. We had drinks in the living room first. For almost 30 minutes, everyone did what families do when a problem has entered the house ahead of them. They performed around it. Chloe talked about a venue issue with her wedding florist. Uncle Robert talked about municipal zoning in Knoxville. Aunt Elise asked me about my last trip to Pennsylvania and whether the leaves had started turning there yet. Diane contributed smoothly to every topic with the remarkable control of a woman determined to prove that she was still the social center of any room she entered. Then at one point, Elise made the mistake. Not a malicious mistake, just an ordinary one. She smiled at me and said, "It's so nice seeing everyone settle after the wedding. Diane said there was a little business misunderstanding recently, but I'm glad all that stress is behind you." The room went quiet so fast it felt rehearsed. I looked at Grant. He looked at his mother. And Diane, without missing a beat, lifted her wine glass and gave a regretful little smile meant to communicate grace under unnecessary family strain. That was the moment. Grant set his glass down on the coffee table with careful precision. Then he said, "It wasn't a misunderstanding." No one moved. Diane's smile held for about 1 second too long. Grant continued, his voice even and perfectly audible. "My mother came to our house while I was out of town with an attorney and documents asking Nora to transfer inherited assets into an entity she controls. That's what happened." You could almost hear the room reorganize itself. Chloe turned so quickly toward Diane that some of her drink nearly spilled. Aunt Elise went still. Uncle Robert blinked twice like he was checking whether he had heard correctly. Martin looked down at the floor with the exhausted expression of a man who had hoped the truth might somehow remain theoretical if no one said it out loud over appetizers. Diane laughed lightly, actually laughed. "Oh, Grant," she said, "that is such an ugly way to characterize—" "No," he said. "It's an accurate way." Her face changed, only slightly, but enough that everyone saw it. She set down her glass and said, "I'm in that tone mothers use when they believe history itself should pause for their disappointment. I was trying to protect this family." Grant did not raise his voice. "By asking my wife for money behind my back?" Diane's jaw tightened. "I was trying to address a temporary problem before it affected everyone." "You mean before Dad found out?" That landed. Martin closed his eyes briefly. Diane flushed, but only high in the cheeks. The rest of her remained controlled. "I was preventing panic. You hired someone to investigate my wife's financial background." "That is not what I did." Martin spoke for the first time. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." No one looked away from Diane now. She glanced at him, stunned for a second, that he had contradicted her in front of witnesses. Then she turned back to Grant with renewed sharpness. "Dice, you have no idea what pressure I was under." Grant said, "Pressure doesn't make this acceptable." Then Diane made the mistake that ended any chance she had of recovering the room. She looked at me, not at her husband, not at her son, at me. And she said, if Nora had simply been transparent from the beginning about what she had, none of this would have happened. There it was. The whole rotten belief in one sentence. Uncle Robert actually frowned. Aunt Elise looked startled. Chloe went pale. And I, who had spent the better part of 2 weeks saying very little in family settings because I did not trust myself to speak without sounding colder than I intended, felt something settle into place. I set my own glass down. Then I said very calmly, "My late mother's estate was never yours to manage around." "No one moved," I continued. "All the fact that you think my privacy created your behavior tells me you still do not understand what you did." Diane opened her mouth, but Grant cut in. "She doesn't owe you disclosure," he said. "She especially doesn't owe you access." The room held that sentence for a moment. Then Chloe, who had been silent through almost the entire exchange, said quietly, "Mom, did you really go to their house with a lawyer?" There is something brutal about disappointment when it comes from the child who still wanted to believe the best. Diane turned toward her daughter and immediately softened her face, but it was too late. Everyone had already seen too much. "It wasn't like that," she said. Chloe stared at her. "Then what was it like?" Diane did not answer directly, because she couldn't. It's because plain language is the enemy of people who survive on reframing. Grant stood up. He did not look dramatic. He looked done. He said, "What's going to happen next is simple. There will be no more conversations with Nora about money, assets, businesses, trust structures, or anything adjacent to them. Not privately, not socially, not by implication. If you have something to say, you say it to me, and you say it knowing the answer will be no." Diane looked stricken now, not because she had suddenly discovered remorse, but because she had lost the one thing she valued most in family conflicts: control of the narrative. She turned to Martin as if he might still rescue her. He didn't. Instead, he said, with a tired steadiness that made the words feel final, "Diane, enough." And when he said it, and even she seemed to understand that the room had shifted somewhere she could not charm it back from. Dinner still happened, technically. People sat. Plates were passed, wine was poured, but the evening was over in every meaningful sense. Conversation never fully recovered. Aunt Elise tried once to ask about Chloe's florist again and gave up halfway through the sentence. Uncle Robert became extremely interested in the breadbasket. Martin thanked me for the meal with such sincere heaviness it almost hurt to hear. Diane barely ate. She did not apologize, not then. Instead, she remained composed in that brittle, deliberate way some women mistake for dignity, when what they are really displaying is fury with nowhere safe to land. When they left, she did not hug me goodbye. She did not hug Grant either. She walked to the car with her back very straight and got in without turning around. After the door closed behind the last guest, Grant stood in the foyer for a moment with both hands on his hips. Then he looked at me and said, "Well." I laughed, not because any part of the evening had been enjoyable, more because once tension stretches that tight, sometimes your body doesn't know what else to do when it finally snaps. Grant laughed too, briefly, then rubbed his face. "I'm sorry that happened here." "It needed to." He nodded, then he said, "She still thinks this is about humiliation." I knew he was right. For me, the core injury had always been the attempt itself. The entitlement, the setup, the calculated pressure. For Diane, the deepest injury now was exposure. And exposed people do not always retreat. Sometimes they regroup. It was after midnight by the time the kitchen was clean. Grant had gone upstairs, exhausted, and I stayed behind to wipe down the counters, mostly because I needed a few extra quiet minutes before sleep. The house had that hollow after-company stillness. Chairs slightly off-center, wine glasses drying by the sink. One candle burned lower than the others. My phone buzzed on the counter, a text from Neil Foster, the attorney. I stared at his name for a second before opening it. The message was short. "I thought you should know Mrs. Mercer has scheduled a meeting Monday regarding restructuring and possible liquidation discussions. She intends to use your refusal as leverage in her explanation of recent financial losses. I am no longer representing her in this matter. I read it twice, then a third time. Your refusal, not her debt. Ours, not her decisions, not her hidden liabilities, my refusal. I stood there in my own kitchen with the dish towel still in one hand and felt the next turn of the story arrive. Because until that moment, Diane had only been trying to take from me. Now she was preparing to blame me. I read Neil's message 4 times before I called Grant back downstairs. He came into the kitchen barefoot and tired, one hand braced on the banister as he descended, and I could tell from my face alone that whatever I was about to say was not small. "What happened?" he asked. I handed him the phone. He read the text once, then again more slowly. His expression did not change much, but that had become one of the ways I recognized how angry he was. The quieter his face got, the more I knew something inside him was moving hard. "She's going to blame you," he said. That I nodded. He looked at the phone again. "And Neil quit." "Apparently." Grant set my phone down carefully on the counter like he didn't trust himself to keep holding it. Then he leaned both hands on the kitchen island and stared at the wood grain for a long moment. "This is unbelievable," he said finally. Though by then I think both of us knew it was entirely believable. That was the problem. A week earlier, it would have shocked us. Now it only clarified the direction everything had already been moving. I asked what restructuring and liquidation discussions meant in practical terms. Grant exhaled slowly. "It means the numbers are worse than Dad admitted, or worse than Dad knew." That made sense. Businesses do not leap straight to liquidation language because one deal fell through. They get there because too many things were already rotting behind the drywall. He picked up his phone and called Martin. This time, Martin answered on the first ring, and from the sound of his voice, he had not been sleeping either. Grant said, "Did you know Mom is meeting with people Monday and planning to blame Nora for the losses?" Silence. Then Martin said with quiet exhaustion, "I found out about the meeting an hour ago. I did not know about the rest." Grant put him on speaker. Martin explained that after the dinner, Diane had apparently reached out to 2 minority stakeholders in the family property group and one longtime outside advisor. She had framed Monday's meeting as a chance to discuss emergency options before the financial situation became irreversible. Martin said he had only learned of it because one of the stakeholders was an older cousin named Richard, called him privately to ask why he had not mentioned that Grant's wife had declined a family rescue proposal. That phrase made something in my stomach go cold. Declined a family rescue proposal? Look at how cleanly that removes the ambush, the pressure, the deception, the private attorney visit, the outdated information, the entitlement. It transforms coercion into generosity refused. It converts theft into help denied. Martin sounded ashamed as he repeated it. Grant asked, "What exactly has she told them?" Martin hesitated. Then he said that she explored all internal solutions available before considering asset sales, and that one of those options was support from family members who chose not to participate. Family members. Not me by name, at least not yet, but close enough. I asked, "Did she mention that the support she requested involved my inheritance?" Martin was quiet for half a second too long. Then he said, "Not in those terms." "Of course not." Grant straightened. "She's not going to use Nora as a shield for her own losses." Martin said, "I agree." The problem was that agreement and control are not the same thing. He might agree, he might even object. But Diane had already begun building her version, and once people like her start laying narrative track, they don't stop because the truth is inconvenient. Martin told us the Monday meeting would be at the Charlotte office at 10 in the morning. He said he intended to be there. He said he would try to stop Diane from making any further reference to me or our marriage. Then, in a voice that was more defeated than angry, he added, "I no longer know what she thinks she can talk her way through." After the call, Grant and I stood in the kitchen under the soft overhead lights, with half the house asleep around us, and both knew the same thing without saying it. We could not simply hope Martin handled it, not because he lacked decency, he had plenty of that, but because decency is often a terrible weapon against someone who has already chosen strategy over shame. I called Walter the next morning at 8:30. He listened without interrupting as I read Neil's text and summarized Martin's call. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. First, had Neil indicated willingness to confirm anything formally if necessary? Second, What exactly did I want out of the situation now? The first question mattered practically. The second mattered more. What did I want? Not revenge. And exactly. I know that is the language people expect in stories like this, but revenge had never been my main instinct. I wanted distance, accuracy, protection. I wanted my name nowhere near Diane's excuses. I wanted no version of events to survive in which I became the woman who refused to save the family and therefore forced painful consequences. Mostly, I wanted her unable to lie comfortably. I told Walter that. He made a small approving sound and said, "Good. That's a much cleaner objective than punishing her. Punishment gets messy. Documentation does not." By noon, he had a plan. Not dramatic, effective. He drafted a formal notice for Diane, copied to Martin and to the outside advisor listed on the summary sheet Neil had accidentally left behind at my house. It stated, in very plain legal language, that I had declined an unsolicited and inappropriate request for voluntary transfer of separate inherited assets into an entity in which I held no ownership, voting rights, or fiduciary protection, that no prior commitment of support had ever been discussed or made, that any suggestion I had withheld, revoked, or refused previously promised financial participation would be false, and that any further use of my name, estate, or marital status in connection with the family entity's debt, restructuring, or losses would be treated as defamatory and legally actionable. Walter sent me the draft for review. I read it 3 times. It was beautiful in the way well-written legal language can be beautiful. No theatrics, no emotion, just doors closing one by one with absolute clarity. Grant read it too and said to send it. So we did. At 2:17 that afternoon, Walter's office confirmed delivery. At 2:29, Diane called Grant. He stared at his phone, then at me. I said, "Answer if you want to, speaker." He did. Diane did not greet either of us. She began mid-temperature, not shouting, but vibrating with furious restraint. "How dare she threaten me through counsel?" Grant's face hardened. "You mean how dare my wife object to being used in your cleanup story?" "I have done no such thing." "You've already started telling people she refused a family rescue." "That is essentially what happened." I leaned back in my chair and felt every last bit of uncertainty leave me. There it was again, not even hidden, not even shaded, just direct entitlement dressed as summary. Grant said no. "What happened is that you came to our house with an attorney while I was away and asked Nora to transfer inherited assets into an entity you control without prior discussion. And now you're trying to turn her refusal into your defense." Diane's voice sharpened. "You have become impossible to speak to since your wife decided to formalize distrust." Grant laughed once under his breath. "You formalized distrust when you brought paperwork." For a second, she said nothing. Then she changed strategy. That was one thing I had started to notice about Diane. She moved between tones the way some people change lanes without signaling. Moral disappointment, injury, authority, tears, confusion, maternal concern, outrage, whichever one might reopen control. This time she chose wounded dignity. "I was trying to avoid losing everything your father built." Grant's answer came faster than I expected. "No," he said. "You were trying to avoid admitting what you'd done with it." That was the first sentence I had ever heard him say to his mother that sounded fully adult. Not son reacting to mother, not child pushing back, just a man naming reality without requesting permission. Diane inhaled sharply, then she said something that told me exactly how cornered she felt. "She has turned you against your own family." Grant's voice stayed level. "You did that yourself." And with that, the call was over in every meaningful sense. She kept speaking for another 20 seconds, but it had all become repetition and blame and collapsing angles. Grant ended it without ceremony. He sat there looking at the black phone screen for a moment, and then he said, "I think that's done." I knew what he meant. Not that the financial mess was over, not that Diane had transformed into someone else, but that the last private emotional lever she believed she had over him had finally snapped. Monday came heavy and gray. I did not go to Charlotte. I had no intention of entering Diane's theater as a character she could point at, but I was present in every other way that mattered. Walter had arranged for an associate in North Carolina to be available if needed. Neil, after some careful communication through counsel, had agreed to confirm the broad outline of the prior solicitation if Diane attempted to misrepresent it as a prior commitment or partially negotiated support package. Martin knew that. Diane knew that. Most importantly, the other people walking into the room on Monday knew. That's because Walter's notice had reached the outside advisor, and from there I had no doubt it circulated exactly where it needed to. I spent that morning at home with my laptop open and my phone face up beside it, trying unsuccessfully to review a quarterly operating report. Grant had gone to the office but warned his team he might be unavailable. Martin was at the meeting in person. We both knew he would call the minute it ended. He called at 11:43. His voice sounded tired but different this time, not confused, settled. "It's over," he said. I asked what happened. He told me in careful order. Diane opened the meeting by outlining cash flow problems, failed refinancing options, vendor pressure, and the likely need to liquidate 2 underperforming properties plus a land parcel they had been holding for appreciation that never came. She attempted at first to preserve ambiguity around prior private support avenues that had not materialized. But before she could say much more, Richard, the older cousin who had called Martin, asked whether those support avenues referred to the son's wife everyone had now heard about through legal correspondence. Legal correspondence, not gossip, not confusion, correspondence. Martin said the room changed right there. Diane apparently tried to object to the wording, but Richard, who I gathered was a man with very little patience for social softening, asked directly whether she had approached me privately for money without involving the rest of the ownership group. Martin answered before she could. He said yes. Then the outside advisor, a woman named Paula who had worked with the family entity on and off for years, but asked Diane whether the requested funds would have entered an entity where I had no control, no security, and no direct recovery rights. Again, Martin answered yes. At that point, Martin said no one in the room was discussing my refusal anymore. They were discussing Diane's judgment. That was the shift I had wanted, not applause, not public humiliation. Just a burden of explanation returned to the person who belonged under it. Martin told me Diane tried to defend herself by saying she had been exploring all options under severe pressure. Richard asked whether all options included transparency with co-owners before soliciting outside personal wealth from a family member by marriage. Paula asked why an inheritance held outside the ownership structure had ever been treated as a legitimate contingency in internal planning. No, another stakeholder, someone Martin described as generally quiet to the point of invisibility, apparently said, "This is exactly why no one trusted the numbers last quarter." That line, more than any dramatic speech could have, seemed to puncture the room. Because the truth about these situations is that the final scandal is usually not the first concern. It is just the first concern people can no longer politely ignore. Martin said no one shouted, no one slammed anything. It was worse than that for Diane. They became formal, distant, specific. They began discussing governance changes, immediate outside review of the books, removal of Diane from unilateral decision authority, mandatory dual sign-off on financial commitments, sale planning overseen by Martin and Paula jointly, and perhaps most cutting of all, in a requirement that no family relationship-based funding discussions occur outside documented group review. In other words, Diane had finally achieved what people like her fear most: process. Not anger, not scandal headlines, process, rules, witnesses, structures that do not care about charm. When Martin finished, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a second, not from happiness, more from release. I asked how Diane took it. Martin was quiet for a moment, then he said badly but quietly. I almost smiled. He added that after the meeting ended, she accused him of betraying her in front of people who did not understand what it had cost to keep things afloat. Martin told her calmly that the betrayal had happened when she tried to solve a business failure by cornering his daughter-in-law in her own kitchen. I thanked him for telling me. Then he said something I did not expect. "I should have seen more sooner," he said, "and I'm sorry you got dragged into what I didn't see." There was no defense in his voice, no request for comfort, just a plain admission. That kind of honesty, rare as it is, always moves me. I told him I appreciated that. After the call, I went outside and sat on the back steps. It was one of those overcast afternoons where the whole neighborhood looks paused. Somewhere 2 houses down, someone was using a leaf blower. A dog barked once and then stopped. My coffee had gone cold beside me, but I drank it anyway. Grant called 10 minutes later. He had already heard from Martin, but he wanted my version too, as if hearing the same facts in my voice made them belong to us more securely. When I finished, he said, I'm proud of you. I laughed a little. For sending a lawyer letter? For not letting her assign you a role in her collapse. That was exactly it. So many women are taught that grace means absorbing what should be named, that kindness means carrying your portion plus the emotional residue of everyone else's bad behavior, that if someone is distressed enough, cornered enough, old enough, maternal enough, connected enough, then the decent thing is to soften your boundaries until they no longer function. I had been raised with enough politeness for that trap to work on me under pressure. What saved me was not superior strength. It was timing. I had already made the important decisions before the pressure arrived. That night, Grant brought home takeout and a bottle of wine neither of us really wanted but opened anyway because ritual matters. And as we ate in the living room without television on, just talking in the low, tired way people do after a long season of bracing, at some point he said, I keep thinking about how close she thought she was. I knew what he meant. She had walked into my house believing she was one emotional conversation away from access, one appeal to family, one implication about what kind of wife I wanted to be, one lawyer folder and one carefully chosen hour. She had no idea the door she thought she was knocking on had been bricked shut before I ever put on my wedding dress. I said, she wasn't close at all. He looked at me and smiled faintly. No, he said, but she thought she was. A week later, Diane called me directly. Not Grant, me. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened. Her message was only 40 seconds long. Her voice was perfectly composed. She said she did not think our relationship should be permanently defined by one unfortunate period of fear and pressure. She said she hoped I understood that when people are scared, they sometimes make choices from desperation rather than character. She said she would appreciate the chance to speak privately and move forward as family. I deleted the message after saving a copy. Then I forwarded it to Walter, then I never answered. Some offers are really requests for you to help someone rewrite your own memory. I had no interest in that. By late November, the property sales were underway. Martin and Paula had taken over the restructuring process. Richard, I was told, had become annoyingly vigilant in a way that was probably saving everyone a great deal of money. Chloe had stopped calling her mother daily. Grant still spoke to Diane, and but rarely, and never about anything meaningful unless there was another boundary to restate. The strange thing was that my life, outside the family drama, remained deeply ordinary. I still flew to Pennsylvania for meetings. I still reviewed payroll summaries and capital expenditure proposals. I still argued gently with Grant over whose turn it was to replace the outdoor light bulbs. I still forgot to thaw things for dinner and ended up making eggs at 9:30 at night. That is one of the things I think people misunderstand about these stories. The betrayal feels cinematic while it's happening, but your actual life keeps moving in plain clothes around it. Laundry, coffee, email, grocery list, conference calls. You are still yourself inside it, still answering messages and paying bills and deciding whether the avocados are too soft. And then one day you realize the crisis has stopped living in the center of the room. It is still there. It may always be there, off to one side. But it is no longer naming the whole house. The first time I fully felt that was in October, almost 4 months after Diane's visit, when Grant and I went to the lake house. He had known about it by then for some time, of course. Not just its existence, but what it meant to me. It sat on quiet water in western New York, all weathered wood and old stone steps, and a long narrow dock my mother had rebuilt one summer because she hated wasteful contractors and trusted almost no one's measurements but her own. We drove up on a Thursday and arrived just before sunset. The trees had started turning, gold, rust, red. The air smelled cold and clean. When Grant stepped out of the car, he just stood there for a moment, taking it in. Then he looked at me and said softly, "Okay, now I understand why this place belongs in a trust." I laughed so hard I had to lean against the car door. It was the first truly easy laugh I had had about any part of this. Inside, everything was still mostly the way my mother left it. The blue ceramic bowl by the sink, the wool blankets folded in the cedar chest, The framed black and white photo of her at 38, standing on the dock with a cordless drill in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, looking deeply unimpressed by whoever was taking the picture. On our second morning there, Grant and I sat outside with coffee just after sunrise. The lake was flat and silver. No wind yet, no boats. Just that clean early stillness that makes you feel the world before people fully enter it. Grant said, "I've been thinking about your mother." I turned toward him. He looked out over the water as he spoke. "She must have known people would try to make you feel guilty for what she left behind." I thought of her instantly. The way she used to review contracts with one hand around a mug. The way she distrusted vagueness. The way she never confused generosity with surrender. "Yes," I said, "she knew." Grant nodded slowly. "She built this. She built the company. She built all of it. And somehow your mother's work was treated by my family like loose fabric they might cut for repairs." That image was so precise and so quietly angry that I felt something deep in me settle. "Yes," I said again. "That's exactly what it felt like." He took my hand then, and we sat there in silence with the coffee cooling between us. It would be neat to say that was the end of it, that Diane transformed, or that one humiliating governance meeting permanently cured her of the belief that other people's boundaries were obstacles rather than facts. That would not be true. What was true was smaller and more durable. She learned she could not reach me. She learned she could not use my marriage as a side door. She learned that if she tried to turn me into an explanation for her own failures, the paper trail would turn and point back at her. And some lessons, even when they do not improve a person, still protect everyone around them. There was only one thing left after that. One conversation I had avoided because I knew it would not be easy, and because, unlike Diane, it actually mattered to me what the other person felt. It happened 2 weeks after the lake house trip, on a cold Tuesday night in our kitchen, when Grant asked me a question I had known was still waiting between us. And I realized that protecting what my mother built had been the easy part. Telling my husband the one truth underneath all of it was harder. It happened on a Tuesday night because of course it did. By then, Tuesday had become our most ordinary ritual. We cooked together unless one of us was traveling. Nothing elaborate. Usually pasta, roasted vegetables, some variation of chicken, sometimes a recipe one of us overestimated and regretted halfway through. There was something about doing the same small domestic thing every week that made it easier to tell the truth. You could be stirring a pan and still say something that changed the room. One that night I was standing at the stove finishing a sauce while Grant sliced bread at the counter. The kitchen windows had gone black with evening. The dishwasher hummed softly. Everything felt settled, familiar, earned. Then Grant said without preamble, "Can I ask you something and have you answer it plainly?" I turned off the burner. "Yes." He rested the knife on the cutting board and looked at me. "Were you protecting the assets from my family?" he asked, "or from me too?" It was not an accusation. That made it harder. If he had sounded angry, defensive, insulted, I would have known what shape to answer in. But he sounded calm, careful, the way people sound when they are asking for something they are afraid to hear. I leaned back against the stove and thought about lying for half a second. Not a full lie, just a softened answer. And then something like mostly your family, or not really, or it wasn't about you. Something designed to preserve the tenderness of the room. But the whole reason we had made it this far was because the truth had finally become more useful than comfort. So I said, both. Grant did not move. I went on before fear could make me start editing. Not because you had done anything wrong, you hadn't. And not because I thought you were waiting for access. I didn't think that. But yes, I was protecting them from you too, in the sense that I was protecting them from what marriage legally becomes. If life changes people, if grief changes people, if loyalty changes shape under pressure, if one day we stop being who we were on our wedding day. He looked down at the counter. I kept talking, because once that truth starts, and then the only kind thing to do is finish it cleanly. My mother spent her whole life watching women get talked out of what they knew. Not always by bad men, sometimes by decent men in difficult circumstances, sometimes by love or guilt or illness or family needs or one emergency after another until separate things were not separate anymore. She used to tell me that trust is a beautiful thing, but documentation is what survives bad timing. A faint smile touched his mouth at that, but it faded quickly. I said, "When I went to Walter before the wedding, I wasn't predicting that you would betray me. I was refusing to build a future that depended on my ability to predict who any of us might become under enough pressure. He nodded very slightly, then he asked, still looking down, "So when you said yes to marrying me, part of you was already preparing for the possibility that one day you might need protection from being married to me?" "Yes," I said. The word sounded harsher in the room than it had in my head. Grant took a breath and let it out slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sauce cooled in the pan. The bread sat half sliced. Somewhere outside, a car door shut on the street. Then he looked up at me. There was hurt in his face. Not outrage, not betrayal. Hurt. The ordinary human kind that comes when you are told you were loved honestly, but not innocently. "I appreciate you telling me the truth," he said. I almost laughed at the cruelty of that sentence. It was such a decent response that it made me feel worse. I stepped closer to him. "Grant." He shook his head once, not to stop me entirely, but to keep me from rushing in with comfort before he had finished standing where he was. "I get it," he said. "Intellectually, I get it, especially now, especially after my mother. I understand why you did what you did. But part of me still wishes the answer had been no." "I know." He looked at me for a long second. Then he said, "Did you ever think you might tell me and then not go through with the protections?" "No." That answer came immediately. And oddly, that was the answer that helped most. Because it was plain, not flattering, not evasive, not a performance of softness to make him feel chosen after the fact. He let out a breath and nodded once. "Okay," he said quietly. "That's actually easier to respect than a prettier answer." We ate dinner late that night and not very hungrily. The conversation after that stayed calm. But it went deep in the way conversations do when both people understand they are handling something fragile and important. Grant told me that being loved by someone cautious is different from being loved by someone naive, and that he was still deciding whether one was harder to receive than the other. I told him caution was not the opposite of love for me. It was often the form love took when I wanted something to survive reality. He asked whether I had ever imagined a version of marriage where none of that legal protection felt necessary. I said yes, when I was younger. Then my mother got sick. Then I watched people change around her money before she was even gone. Not evil people, just people who started speaking in tones they didn't know they had. Relatives asking logistical questions too early. A man she once dated calling after years of silence. Advisors shifting from concern to positioning. Nothing dramatic enough for a movie. Just enough to teach me that money is not only money. It is memory, labor, identity, opportunity, and projection. People smell all of that even when they tell themselves they are only being practical. Grant listened to every word. Then he surprised me again. He said, "I think the part that hurts isn't that you protected what was yours. It's that by the time we got married, you had already learned a lesson about people that I hadn't learned yet. So you walked into marriage seeing a weather pattern I still thought was theoretical." That was exactly right. I said so. And because he is who he is, or because underneath all the hurt and family disappointment and male pride he had every social excuse to hide behind, there is still a man more interested in truth and performance. He nodded and said, "I'm catching up." That conversation did not solve everything in one night. I don't think good marriages work like that. People say one true thing and it helps, then another true thing has to be said a month later, and maybe another 6 months after that. The repair is not one dramatic bridge, it's boards laid carefully over time. But after that Tuesday, something between us became sturdier. Not lighter, sturdier. Because now even the least flattering truth had been spoken aloud in our kitchen and survived. Over the winter, life settled into a shape I could finally trust again. The family property business on Martin's side sold two of the underperforming assets. The sales were not glamorous, which I privately found satisfying. No miracle buyer, no triumphant last-minute rescue, just market-correct numbers, negotiated concessions, painful realism, and the kind of boring, competent process that becomes necessary after someone has spent too long trying to solve math with ego. Diane was still around, of course. Women like Diane do not disappear. They adapt. She became unfailingly polite to me in public, not warm, not intimate, just polished in a way that made the distance itself part of the etiquette. If we were seated at the same table, she asked whether I wanted sparkling or still water. She complimented my coat. She once asked whether the flight from Pittsburgh had been delayed. What she did not do anymore was ask a single question about money, business structures, property, travel arrangements tied to family houses, or anything that could be interpreted as looking for openings. She had learned. Not remorse, necessarily. Range. That was enough. Chloe came around slowly. At first, she kept a cautious distance from the whole situation, which I understood. When your mother has detonated the family illusion, neutrality can feel like the last clean room left in the house. But around December, she started calling me directly now and then. Small reasons at first. A recipe question, a recommendation for a contractor in Nashville. Then one afternoon, out of nowhere, she asked if I wanted to get coffee the next time she was in town. We met at a place near Belmont on a cold Saturday morning. Halfway through the conversation, she looked down at her cup and said, "I need to tell you something." And I'm embarrassed I didn't say it sooner. I waited. She said, "I used to think my mom was just strong, efficient, the one who handled things when other people got emotional. I didn't realize how much of that was just control with better tailoring." That was such a precise sentence, I nearly smiled. Instead, I said, "It takes a while to see clearly when you were raised inside the lens." She looked relieved and sad and maybe a little ashamed. Then she asked very quietly, "Did she really think you'd sign?" "Yes." Chloe stared at the table for a moment. Then she said, "That's the part I can't get past." For me, that was never the hardest part to understand. The women like Diane always believe pressure works because pressure has usually worked for them before. The harder part was this. She had been willing to build that pressure on the assumption that I would trade my mother's life's work for acceptance. That was the insult under all the paperwork. Not that she wanted the money, that she thought belonging would be enough to buy me away from myself. Spring came, then summer. By the time our first anniversary arrived, the whole crisis had the strange texture of something both recent and far away. Close enough that I still remembered the cream jacket, the leather folder, the exact pitch of Diane's voice when she said family contribution. Far enough that our daily life no longer organized itself around the fallout. For our anniversary, Grant asked if I wanted a trip, a dinner, something formal. And I said I wanted Vermont. He smiled and said, "I was hoping you'd say that." So we went. Not as an escape, not as symbolism, though I'm sure it was that too. Just because by then the lake house had become ours in the only way a place can become shared, without losing where it came from. Grant never acted like it was automatically his. That mattered. He treated it as a gift of access, not of entitlement. He fixed small things when they needed fixing, carried wood without announcing it, learned where the extra blankets were kept, asked before changing anything, understood instinctively that respect is often visible in how little you assume. On the second evening, we took wine down to the dock and sat with our feet tucked under blankets while the light went gold over the water. Grant asked me whether my mother would have liked him. I thought about that carefully. Then I said, "Yes. But she would have watched you for at least a year first." He laughed. "I would expect nothing less. She would have liked that you don't confuse access with love." That quieted him. After a second, he said, "I learned that from you." I looked out over the water. "No," I said, "you learned it because when it mattered, you were willing to." That is the thing I came to believe most fully after everything with Diane. Character is not proven by never being shaped by the people around you. It is proven by what you do when one loyalty collides with another and you are forced to decide whether comfort matters more than truth. Grant chose truth. Not instantly, not perfectly, not without grief, but clearly. And that mattered more than whether I had once protected myself against the possibility that he might not. A few weeks after our anniversary trip, I got a letter from Walter in one of his usual plain envelopes. Inside was a routine packet about annual trust review and updated summaries. At the bottom of his cover note, handwritten in blue ink, he had added one sentence. "Your mother would consider this year's outcome administratively satisfactory." I laughed out loud in my office. That was exactly his style and exactly hers. Not emotionally triumphant, administratively satisfactory. But later that evening, after work, after dinner, after the dishes were done, and the windows had gone dark, and the house was quiet around me, I sat for a while. with that phrase and thought about all the years underneath it. My mother at 30, as taking on contracts men twice her age thought she could not handle. My mother at 42, standing in steel toe boots in a warehouse office reviewing invoices. My mother at 58, buying the lake house in cash because she wanted one thing nobody could leverage against her. My mother at 61, thinner from treatment, still correcting a vendor agreement from her hospital recliner because, as she put it, if she was going to be sick, she might as well also be right. She did not leave me money, not really. She left me years. Years of getting up early. Years of making decisions no one clapped for. Years of earning enough knowledge to tell the difference between generosity and surrender. Years that eventually became assets, yes, but more importantly became instruction. That was what Diane never understood. When she sat in my kitchen with her attorney and her folder and her composed little speech about partnership, she thought she was asking for funds. She wasn't. She was asking me to treat my mother's life as liquid. And that was never going to happen. If there is one thing I want any woman listening to this to hear, it is this: protecting what you built, what your mother built, what your grandmother saved, what your own labor earned, does not make you cold. It does not make you suspicious. It does not make you less loving, less generous, less marriageable, less good. It makes you responsible. People talk about trust as though it is proven by removing every lock. I don't believe that anymore. Maybe I never really did. Trust is not the absence of locks. Trust is knowing exactly where the locks are, who has keys, and who still stays. But 6 weeks into my marriage, my mother-in-law showed up with an attorney because she believed I would rather be accepted than be protected. She believed I would confuse discomfort with duty. She believed I would sign because saying no would feel too sharp, too selfish, too difficult for a new wife trying to belong. What saved me was not quick thinking in the moment. It was a decision made earlier in a lawyer's office, before anyone was watching, before anyone was asking, before anyone had a chance to make me feel guilty for being careful. You do not secure your home after someone is already in the hallway. You do it before. And that, more than anything, is why I can still sit on that dock in Vermont with coffee in my hands and my husband beside me and feel peace when the sun comes up. Not because no one ever tried, because when they did, and they found the door was already closed,